But the reason why the convention is during this time of year is because the Lubavitcher Rebbe, of whom we are his emissaries, so the convention is scheduled around the yahrzeit, the passing anniversary of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's Rebbitzin, the wife, Rebbitzin Shaya Mushka Schneerson, whose yahrzeit is the 22nd day of the Hebrew month of Shvat, which this year will be Sunday night and Monday. So the convention for Chabad women is always this weekend, the weekend adjacent to her yahrzeit. So I just thought in preparation to this, to our get together today, to utilize the time that we have together in commemoration of this yahrzeit. Number one, there are stories that we can share about Rebbe Chaya Mushka, many stories. But I kind of chose one story that I'll share with you in just a moment, and then also to study something, to actually learn something in association with the yahrzeit that hopefully we will find meaningful as well. And if at any point anybody has a comment, a question, or something to say, I'm really not used to speaking for 45 minutes or an hour straight without being interrupted. Even though sometimes I pray not to be interrupted, it's very uncommon. So I've grown very unaccustomed not to be interrupted every couple of minutes. So if you have something to say, please don't hesitate. So if you've heard a story of Rebbe Chaya Mushka, you're welcome to share. There are many, many, many that I'm aware of, and I'm sure many more that I'm not aware of, but I've just chosen one that I've found in the recent years very moving to me, a very short anecdote that is very meaningful, and that's what I'll share with you, and then we'll move on to some further learning. The story is when the Rebbe and Rebbitzin first got married, they lived in Berlin together, and then shortly after that is when World War II began, and they left Germany, they left Berlin, they went to France, and in all of the running from city to city, from country to country, at one point in time, in one city in France, they fell under an atmosphere of bombs. They were actually shelling, bombs coming down, raining down, as they were running with many, many others. And Rebbe Chaya Mushka, who was probably, let's say, or maybe right around 30 years of age at the time, she had noticed a shell that was about to explode, and there was a gentleman, a man, right there, and she decided to push him away before the bomb had a chance to explode. And in doing so, she literally saved his life. When that's the episode, but that's not the part of the story that I find meaningful. When she years later shared this story, and she didn't share it voluntarily, but there was a historian that was trying to write up a little bit of context to the Rebbe and Rebbitzin's life, because what was happening was the Rebbe was writing letters. There was a lot of correspondence that the Rebbe was giving to people, and the Rebbe's correspondence continued even during World War II times under very strenuous circumstances. So when the letters of the Rebbe were being published, removing, of course, first any personal or private relevant information. When the Rebbe's letters were being published in volumes, today you can purchase a set of over 30 volumes of the Rebbe's letters that have been published, personal advice that the Rebbe gave for the various circumstances in people's personal life.
You can't hear this, correct?
What was that? You with me?
There's background talk. They have to be muted.
Okay, good. It makes me feel comfortable. So they were publishing letters, and when they were publishing these letters, every time they published a volume of letters of the Rebbe, as an introduction to that volume, they would write up some historical background about the conditions that the Rebbe was in during the time that he was writing these letters, to help the reader be able to either appreciate some context to the whatever the content was in the letters that the Rebbe wrote during those times, whether there were scholarly letters in terms of answers to questions in Torah or on more personal matters. So in doing so, the person who was assigned to compile these letters and make this volume of letters he didn't know enough about the timeline of the 1930s. He didn't know enough of what was going on in the Rebbe and Rebbitzin's life because of how private they were. So he had the opportunity, the Rebbitzin had given him the opportunity for an hour or two to sit with her and ask her questions about their lives during that time. So in that occasion, she shared this story, and in sharing the story that I just shared with you, where she pushed a man essentially saving his life from an explosion, she mentioned that till today she was doing teshuvah for pushing this man. And so when this compiler said, "But Rebbitzin, what's there to do teshuvah for? You saved this man's life," and she says, "Yes, but nonetheless, for pushing another person, you never finish doing teshuvah." So it's just one sentence that struck me very profoundly, and I try to be extra sensitive to that for hurting another person. And usually back at home in Asheville, when I share this concept, even if not this story specifically, I usually associate it with a custom that many of you might be familiar with. On Shabbat, on Shabbos, when we make the Kiddush, the Borei Pri Agofen on the cup of wine, we have a tradition to cover the bread, to cover the challah. Who's familiar with that tradition? You can raise your hand. Why is it that we cover the challah when we make the Kiddush? Somebody want to tell me? Go ahead, you can unmute yourself.
The bracha on the challah is higher than that on the wine, so therefore we need to cover the challah.
Exactly. So actually, there is an order of superiority in blessings, without getting too distracted with the concept of it. But there's an order of a hierarchy of blessings. The highest blessing to make is the hamotzi lechem min haaretz, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, on the bread. Always when you have a variety of items on the table in front of you, there's an order of what you might make a blessing on first. The most superior blessing is hamotzi, and typically when there's hamotzi on the table or anything else on the table, grape juice or wine, the motzi comes first. On Shabbat, we usher in the Shabbat and we make Kiddush. We have a tradition, we have a custom to do that over a cup of wine, some on grape juice, and the blessing for that is hagafen, which is inferior to the bread, but we only make the blessing on the bread afterwards. So in the language of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, in order not to embarrass the bread, we cover the bread while we make the Kiddush, the blessing on the wine. And it's very difficult for me to really appreciate the idea that the challah, the bread, would have any degree of embarrassment. The bread doesn't have feelings, even though today I think people are starting to attribute feelings to inanimate objects, and I think probably Asheville might be the leader in this type of sensitivity. Perhaps that's the case, perhaps, but I'm not here necessarily to discuss that. I think it's more a lot of the traditions and customs in Judaism are designed to develop a sensitivity within the people who are observing it. And just to observe a sensitivity of the challah, who might not have feelings, but is just not accustomed to make a blessing of hagafen before it, we have this sensitivity not to shame it. And I think just to be able to, within ourselves, try to develop that type of sensitivity. Again, also, you might have studied this in the last couple of weeks, the story of Moses and Aaron bringing the 10 plagues onto Egypt. We know that Moses was not able to be involved in the first 2 or 3 of the 10 plagues. Why was he not the agent through which Hashem brought those plagues? Because the first 2, the plague of the water turning into blood, and then the frogs coming up from the water, it was intended to use Aaron's staff, Aaron's stick, to strike the water, and that's going to initiate the plague. And since Moses' life, 80 years earlier, when he was an infant, Moses' life was spared by the water, Moses, 80 years later, wasn't able to strike the water. Why not? Why not? And the answer is given because that would be very ungrateful to the water that saved his life some 80 years earlier. And this is quite stunning to think that, number one, if Moses struck the water, it would cause any pain to the water. Water doesn't either have emotions or feelings, would have no awareness of Moses hitting the water, just like it had no awareness that he's the one who saved Moses' life in the first place. The water not aware that it saved Moses' life, certainly didn't do anything deliberate to save Moses' life. Nonetheless, here's a sensitivity that Moses had towards the water. We're talking about 80 years later. So again, that's all about the sensitivity. So I bring it back to the Rebbitzin. The Rebbitzin here, who literally saved somebody else's life through pushing them to the ground, and I'm sure that individual could have been forever grateful to her. Nonetheless, objectively to that, the whole concept of pushing another person requires within ourselves the idea of tshuva. So again, just to be able to be exposed to this type of sensitivity, to this type of royalty, to this type of righteousness, just being exposed to it and being aware of these kind of things, I think is a beautiful thing, and it develops a heightened awareness and sensitivity within ourselves. So that's the thought, that's the remark. At the same time, I want to go on to study a Mishnah together. So I can pause now for any comments or questions, and then I'll, after I get the go-ahead from there, I'll share with you the Mishnah that I have in mind to study together, and hopefully for it to be meaningful with the time that we still have. Anybody have a question, a comment, a thought, a rebuttal? Somebody's got to argue over here. You study Talmud together, and there's nobody that has anything to. Yeah, go ahead.
I believe that it's very, very remarkable because everything that we study in Judaism is pointing to humans being spiritually one of the highest kind of points of creation. That's why, in my opinion, we are not actually show respect to objects, to water or bread or something else. It's just somehow it plays well with our spiritual world, where if someone was saved from the river of Nile as a baby, has kind of, has appreciation or feelings of appreciation that is expressed in him not trying to, to do something inappropriate with water. The same, in my opinion, is when the blessing to bread is done. It's just, for us, it's important to have a priority of things because we are spiritual, because we are emotionally much more advanced. And I truly believe that it's one of the unique parts of Judaism that makes some other, not that, want to put anything down, but it just really makes it very special and important.
Yeah.
Oh, that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Okay. So what I'd like to do now is I want to study a Mishnah together with you all. And this Mishnah, the reason I chose this Mishnah is because it's very much associated with the Yortzeit, even though you might not see the immediate connection, but it's a Mishnah that's recited, and what what I'll do is here, it's a very meaningful Mishnah, even though if we study it, first we'll study it in the very raw form, and we might not recognize anything really meaningful in it. But then I'd like to share it with you, I think, in the way the Lubavitcher Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchok Schneerson, who was a great Kabbalist, the way he explains this Mishnah. And I use the term the way he explains this Mishnah very, very, very loosely, because usually his explanations for the common person, it becomes much more complicated. So what we'll do after we understand the way he teaches this Mishnah, we'll learn the way the Rebbe's father studies this Mishnah, but thankfully we'll be able to learn it the way the Rebbe teaches his father's teachings to this Mishnah. And the beautiful thing is that the Rebbe teaches this Mishnah no less than to young children. Okay, so here I'll share with you the Mishnah, and we'll take it step by step. The Mishnah it's from the tractate of Mikvaot, from the laws of Mikvah. Mikvah is a body of water, a pool of water that's gathered in a very particular way. We're not going to go through the details of how the mikvah, those details, but it's a pool of water with a certain measurement that the average human being could fit in comfortably and immerse themselves. And during an era when there halachically there was tuma and tahara, spiritual impurity, ritual impurity, a person would have to immerse themselves in a mikvah, or for that matter, items too, beds, furniture, anything that was exposed to spiritual impurity would have to immerse themselves in a body of water for purification in order to be able to interact with again. So it doesn't feel like a very inspiring type of Mishnah or study, but this is the technicality of it. So the Mishnah overall talks about a bed that came in contact with a human corpse, for example, and so this bed became spiritually impure, Tommy. And then the Mishnah describes how it's necessary for it to be immersed in water in a mikveh, and in the times of the Mishnah, they didn't have tiled mikvahs or anything like that. Usually it was just a dug out hole, and sometimes the bottom of that mikveh was earth, sand, so anybody standing on the bottom of that, certainly a bed that went into the mikveh, the legs of the bed was able to kind of sink into the earth a little bit. So it discusses questions about the validity of that immersion or not, and it describes that it still purifies. Okay, but the way this Mishnah concludes, it talks about something very interesting. It talks about a machat. A machat is a needle. I should have brought like a sewing needle, like a little needle. And the Mishnah describes what happens if a needle became tummy. What happens if a needle becomes spiritually unclean? Well, how does that happen? Well, like we described, without getting too far into it, how does a needle become tummy, spiritually unclean? Because it came in contact with something that was tummy. Okay, the question now is, how do you immerse a needle in a mikveh to be able to make it pure again? The trouble is, a needle, if you try to immerse it in a mikveh, you can easily lose it, fall to the bottom of the mikveh, especially if there are no tiles there, you can sink into the ground that's underneath the mikveh. So the Mishnah says, you're allowed to take the needle and put it on the steps, on the top step of the mikveh. So you have steps going down into this pool of water, into the mikveh. You're allowed to place the needle onto the top step of the mikveh, and then you're allowed to, with your hand, kind of cause a wave in the water of the mikveh, and like this, the water of the mikveh will wave right over the step on which the needle is there, and it will wash over the needle, and that will be enough for the needle to become tahor, for the needle to become spiritually pure.
Question.
Yes.
What about the bottom of the needle that's in touch with the step? Isn't the
So-
water
so-
supposed to surround the entire needle?
Correct. So the idea is that the number one, the sand, first of all, it'll cause the needle to float slightly. It just won't be enough for the needle to kind of swim off the step and get lost. So the wave will cause a little bit of a shift in the needle to cause water to be fully surrounded, and the loose earth that's on that is that step, as long as it's loose enough also, that wouldn't be considered an interference. Fantastic question. So that's the concept of the Mishnah. That's the raw Mishnah. Anybody find this inspiring, meaningful in any particular way? I mean, we've just studied Torah together, very powerful. But
Question.
yes, go ahead.
Is there a reference to this Mishnah on Chabad.org that we can read with you as we're going through the process today?
Oh, that would be nice.
It would be.
Sorry, I'll prepare better next time. I don't know offhand. I would have to go search Chabad.org.
Rabbi,
Yeah. Rabbi Smith, is somebody able to quickly look at Chabad.org to see if there's I feel like there must be.
Yeah, I'm sure there is. Are you going to be continuing explaining more parts of the Mishnah, or just whatever you said?
That's the Mishnah. That's the whole thing. So just the passage of
Can I-
Achat Shehina Sunnah Amayra Samayra. If we
can
can
I
get that
ask
in
about
English.
that needle?
What was that? Sorry, go ahead.
Ben, what
I
were you
wanted to
saying?
say, wouldn't it be simpler to put a thread to the needle and hold it?
See, but that, back to the earlier question, that would be problematic.
Can you
In
hear
other
me?
words, because the thread, that's a great idea, but that could be problematic in terms of the thread might be an interference between the water for everything to
Okay.
be immersed simultaneously. But
And the
possible.
needle.
okay, but what I want to do here is I
had another thought,
Oh,
which is basically what I normally do.
okay.
Is you normally, there are these sort of not baskets, but these like
Strainer.
if you have a pool, you can normally use these things in order to pick up stuff that appears on the bottom of the pool.
Right.
But you have one of these things and you place it below, but in the water, but below. And then you drop the needle into the water
And it would
so
catch.
that it floats down and is caught by this thing.
Yeah.
It's-
That's likely that would work. That would work.
So I know they may not have had these things back in the day when the Mishnah was written.
Mhm.
I mean, not everybody had pools. So, but I would have thought even putting some kind of someone holding a cloth of some kind underneath,
Mhm.
then dropping the needle into the water, into the cloth. You catch the needle. The needle is completely free to and immersed by the water. And then there is no problem of worrying whether or not the needle will be lifted up by the small wave or whatever.
All right. So how about this? So let's pause it. And the technicalities of this Mishnah we can discuss further, but there may be quite a beautiful intention, an explanation that will help us appreciate the significance of why the Mishnah speaks exactly the way it does.
Excuse me for a second, Rabbi.
Yeah, sure.
What they're talking about is a net or a skimmer, it's actually called.
Yeah.
But if you're doing that and you drop the needle into the water to let it float down, it is very thin. You're not going to see if it's going in the exact spot you want. And there's a chance that it may not hit the skimmer.
Mhm.
And somebody may get stuck with it with their foot if they walk in.
Mhm.
Can I contribute to the conversation, please?
Absolutely. Sure.
I'd like to continue with the premise the rabbi started with relative to what the printed Mishnah is so we can study it and understand it within the context of which he's sharing with us. Okay? Can we agree upon that?
Yes. So let's go ahead. Let's go ahead with that. Are we able to bring the mission up on the screen, or should we continue without it?
Let's share. Yeah, let me try that. Share screen.
Safaria.
Paste.
With the Safaria, but wherever we can find the citation would be helpful.
If you got
Okay, here it is. Here it is. Here, share screen.
Mishnah and Mitzvahs,
If you look in the Chabad Siddur,
Yeah, it's in the, here. We're all set. Here it's
There we go.
it's right at the
Alright.
end over here.
Oh,
7. If one immerse the bed, this one. A needle right here.
There we go. Okay, so a needle. Thank you very much. A needle which is placed on the step leading down to a mikveh in a cave, and the water is moved back and forth. As soon as a wave has passed over it, it becomes ritually clean. In essence, the novelty of this citation in the Mishnah is that it doesn't even have to go into the mikveh. It could rest on the step, and you can cause a wave to go over it, and that is sufficient to purify this needle. Okay, so the Rebbe shares this Mishnah, and he, no less, when he taught this Mishnah during what we call a children's rally. Several times throughout the year, there was a time that only children entered the main synagogue of 770, and the Rebbe would address the children alone. Adults would pay attention too, but the Rebbe would address. So here you have sometimes the loftiest concepts that the Rebbe took and found the language to be able to explain it to young children, and that's what we're going to study over here. And the Rebbe says, in the name of his father, that a needle, as a matter of fact, the Mishnah is talking about it here, is talking about the most life-changing description. A needle is the entire purpose of each and every one of us. Our mission, the purpose of our lives, each and every one of us is captured in this passage of the Mishnah by the needle. How so? What is a needle? Not what is a needle in the sense of its value is not in the metal that it contains, because the metal is not enough in a needle to be of any significant value. You'd have to put together thousands of pieces of needles for it to have any significant in terms of its or value in terms of the metal that it contains. But a needle's purpose lies in what it can do, in what it does, not so much in itself. What does a needle do? What is the function of a needle in the terms of sewing? The function of a needle is to connect, to take two things that are separate and to sew them together to make them into one. So the Rebbe says that each one of us, by virtue of our being, we are the needle. And we are here in this world. Our purpose lies in connecting two things that have the appearance of being apart from each other and have the appearance of being opposites. Our job is to sew them together into one. What are those two things? There's the world, which has the appearance of being something separate from its creator, something independent from its maker. And you have its creator. And the job of the human being is to be the needle that sews the two together to make them into one. How do we make them into one? What does it mean to make them into one? The Rebbe shares and says to the children that when a child holds a glass of water and makes a blessing on the glass of water, so the water on its own has its own properties, and you can drink it without making a bracha, and it can all appear to be independent, has its own value. But when a young child makes a bracha, blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, shehakol nihiya b'dvaro, that everything has been created with the word of Hashem, the word of God, this has achieved bringing the creation and sewing it together with the awareness of its maker. And the Rebbe goes even further to share that even if we're not making the bracha on the cup of water, but even if we're just walking down the road and we see a beautiful stream of water, or we see something beautiful, and a body of water, a river, an ocean, or mountains, whatever they are, and we stop, and even if we don't verbalize, but if a child through his own eyes views these things and in his own mind recognizes the greatness of the creator of them, that consciousness, that awareness has sewn together these two aspects. So that's the function of the needle. Now, the Rebbe continues. Let's take a closer look at the needle. A needle has two ends. One end of the needle has a very sharp point. So if our purpose, the purpose of the human being, is to sew these two things together, how does the needle achieve this? Initially, the needle has to poke a hole through, has to pierce it with the sharpness of its point, has to pierce it. This idea represents the notion of the boldness, the strength, the chutzpah, if you will, that the needle has to have, not to be afraid to pierce the world around us. In other words, the world around us has a very powerful veneer. The world around us has very powerful stimulation that could be very distracting to what we know now is the purpose of the needle. So in order for the needle, for us, the human being who is represented by the needle, in order for us not to become influenced by the materialistic stimulation that could often be overwhelming that surrounds us, we have to have at our head, at the head of our needle, we have to be very sharp and be able to pierce the worldly impressions that are around us. That's what's represented by the top, by the point of the needle. At the same time, we have to remember that there is another end to the needle. And the other end to the needle is quite the opposite of what we just described, where we get to not get so along with the world around us. The head, the point of the needle, pierces the world around us. But the other end of the needle actually is what you put the thread. You thread the needle. And essentially what that does is it takes a thread, a material, which, right, the thread is a material, which, by the way, of course, incidentally, the word material represents materialism. It represents the world itself. So what does the needle do? After the needle pierces the material, or the two pieces of material, it threads the materialism of the world. So after it pierces the materialism of the world, it then takes the material of this world and brings it into the mission that it's trying to achieve. What does this mean? I'm going to just pause for a moment to help us appreciate what's going on over here. There are two approaches that we can take to this world. There is to completely mock this world, to despise it, to keep it at arm's distance or further from us. That's represented by the needle of the by the point of the needle. The point of the needle is to pierce the world around us, to negate it, to pierce it. So we could say, if I don't want to be influenced by the stimulation, by the stimuli of the world around us, I'm just going to pierce it. I have nothing to do with it. I'm going to keep it away from me.
Doesn't bring it together.
What was that?
I said, but that doesn't bring anything together.
But that doesn't achieve anything. On the other hand, if we want to bring things together, we have to engage the world around us. The problem is that if we want to engage the world around us without having the Pierce-like character, then what's going to ultimately end up, if we just embrace the world around us, we will most likely become enveloped by it. So how is it that we could, so it's an either or type of thing. If you take one approach, you're not gonna, one of the approach independent of the other, you're never gonna achieve the goal, the purpose of the needle. Piercing the world around us is not going to achieve the goal. It'll make for us not to be influenced negatively from the world around us, but we will not have achieved our purpose of bringing the two items together. If we embrace the world around us, that's just too powerful alone for us to be able to envelop it. We'd more be enveloped by it, which ultimately become absorbed by it, which will be detrimental as well. The idea is to be able to be that needle that's able to contain both. After we know that within ourselves, at our point, we are capable of piercing the world around us, not being influenced by it, but trying to influence it, then we can embrace the back end of our needle, which incorporates the material of this world and utilizes it to bring both elements together. And that's the function of the needle when the Mishnah says what it says. Now, I'm going to pause here, even though the Rebbe continues on the other parts of the Mishnah, and if we have time, we can continue to those also. But I think this is a good stopping point. If we look at
Isaac had a question, Rabbi.
No, it's a beautiful analogy. I'm only asking, the key seems to be, if you're using the essence of the thought of the needle and the thread, one is to make sure you are firm in your own presence.
Correct.
Because it has to be one smooth needle that keeps its integrity, even though it is mixing with the fabric.
Correct.
So you can't use jelly as a needle. You have to have steel.
Yeah.
And two, you have to keep moving.
Exactly.
You can never just sit there. The needle only accomplishes as long as it's moving. It doesn't sit back.
Yeah, it's not designed to stay stuck in middle. The needle is not meant to be stuck in middle over there. Eventually, you take the needle out of the equation and you have the finished product without the needle.
Yeah, but is there ever any finished product? You have a needle that is sharp, it is shiny, and it's forever going forward, and you're surrounding yourself by the elements it's penetrating. So it's a consistent and constant.
Keeping in mind, the idea again is just to connect with God.
Right,
Everybody connects their own way.
But you're always moving towards that.
And you never stop because there's no limit.
So here's the thing. Let's look at this a little further. It's not up on the screen yet, but let me read the Mishnah again, or we had it up before. So far we described a needle which is placed on the step leading down to a mikveh in a cave. So we talked about the needle. That's really all we really talked about so far. The purpose of the needle is to bring two things together that otherwise would appear to be opposites, not just opposites, but they would appear to be opponents to each other, literally opponents. So the function of the needle is to bring those two things together. How does the needle achieve that? With its 2 points. It needs both points. It needs to first pierce through the two items that it's trying to bring together, and then through its other end, thread the material through which we're going to sew it all together. So far, we really just talked about the needle. But now the Rebbe continues, though. How did this needle become tameh? We're talking about the needle that became impure. That's what the Mishnah is talking about. So how is it possible that the needle became impure? How does a needle become impure? Because in order for the needle to do the job that we just described has been given to it, it needs to leave the heavenly environment of being exclusively immersed in the study of Torah and observance of mitzvot, and it has to go out to an environment to engage with things that have this independent appearance from God. And in doing so, it is exposed to impurity. And this is part of the sacrifice that Hashem made when he took a neshama, a soul, each of our souls, which is a part of God, a piece of heaven, and gave it a mission in this world. Part of the sacrifice there was, it took a pure soul and put it in an impure environment where the soul itself is exposed to impurity, spiritual impurity, and could become affected by it. That's all of us. This needle has been exposed to spiritual impurity and has also become spiritually impure. You can bring this metaphor in all different environments, but the idea is that this is the way it was intended. Hashem knew that this was going to happen. So the question is, our soul, which is a piece of God, has been placed in a body in this material world, exposed to the elements of spiritual impurity, and we have become impure while we've been doing our mission. While we're doing while the needle is doing its mission, it's exposed to impurity. That's what the mission is talking about. So what should we do? What should we do with this needle?
A splash of water. You don't even need to dip into the whole mikveh. You just need to get a splash of water.
Beautiful. What is water? The Rebbe is telling you. What is water?
Torah.
Beautiful. Water, the Torah is compared to water. And so the Rebbe is telling us that the mission is teaching us that the needle exposed to tumah, to impurity, how does it make sure that it remains pure? By making sure on a daily basis to cause a wave of water to wash over it. And the Rebbe is teaching this to little children. Incorporate in your everyday the study of Torah. An hour, a Mishnah, a passage, whatever it is. At the beginning of the day, at the middle of the day, just cause a wave of water, and that will wash over the needle, and throughout the day, it'll maintain the purity of the needle. There are actually other water is also compared not just to Torah, but for example, you have in other instances on the other end of the spectrum, tirdes haparnasa, worries, physical worries, worries of the material world, of being able to sustain ourselves and nourish ourselves. That also in Kabbalistic terms, in Chassidus, is called mayim rabim, the overwhelming waters, the worries of this material world. Those are also considered water. And one of the reasons Kabbalah teaches, one of the Gemara, I think probably in Masechet Brachos, I think in one of the early dafim, Vav or Zayin, it talks about Tsar Yisurim Shel Ahava. Is that there in the beginning of Brachos?
It does talk about it. I don't know if I'm muted or not.
What was that?
Can you hear me? Yeah, it does. It does mention Yisurim Shel Ahava. Yes.
The Yisurim Shel Ahava, the idea that a person experiences certain struggles or certain suffering in this physical world. What was that?
Challenges.
Challenges.
I wouldn't say it's not in a negative way. It's just the challenges that we
exactly get. That too washes. That too purifies. Those challenges, those purify. And so the Rebbe is saying that the Mishnah is saying, don't worry about it. It's enough, a little wash of challenge. You don't have to be immersed in the challenges of water. You don't have to have an overwhelming amount of memsa, the full measure of what a mikveh is, in order to be purified. It's enough to have a wash, a little wave of water to go over the needle, just a little challenge, that's enough. Hashem, we could turn to God and say, oh, okay, I understand what this is for, but it's a small measure of that should suffice in order to achieve that purification, that tahara of this needle. So now we understand what the wave of water is. The wave of water is the fact that the needle has been exposed to tumah, to impurity, And in order to achieve purity is to create a wave of water to wash over it. Because the neshama, the holy soul, has descended to a lowly enough place to become tummy. Now the Mishnah continues. So a needle which is placed on the step leading down to a mikveh in a cave, and the water is moved back and forth. As soon as the wave is passed over it, it becomes ritually pure. Now the Rebbe says, but it's important to recognize that the needle is placed on the step leading down to the mikveh. That even though we have been placed in a spiritually unclean environment so we could become tummy, it's important to know that we never fully sunk ourselves into this mikveh. We always remained on the step of the mikveh. And you look at the language of the Mishnah, it's called a madrega. It's called a mailas hamayda. Maila is a virtue, is an elevated state. That's why in Hebrew, stairs are called ma'alot, elevations, because naturally the stairs, they're meant to, you go up the stairs. So, but we're looking at it as ma'alat hamayra. We're not fully immersed in this environment. Yes, we were placed in a place of impurity, but we still remain al mailas hamayra. We still remain in the more elevated state of this case.
You're mixing metaphors here.
Okay.
Being in the mikveh is not the place
no, very
being
right.
in the mikveh is being a place of tahara.
True. So let's back up for just a second. It's not the mikveh that we're talking about, that's the impure place. It's the cave that we're talking about. And we didn't mention the cave. So a needle which is placed on the step in a cave. So we are those needles that were placed in the cave. The cave is this unclean world.
Oh.
And that's what has exposed us to impurity. So even while we have been placed in this cave, we should know that we were placed on the step in a cave. We were still, even in this cave, we are in a more elevated space. In other words, we're still a cut above the cave itself. So the cave never really takes grip of who we are. And that's why
the cave has a mikveh.
Right. And the cave has water within it. So we could take the water that's in the cave and cause it to wave, so it will have the water wash over the needle that's on the mila, that's on the elevated state within this cave, and that'll be sufficient.
But the water still has to be connected to the rest of the mikveh, because you can't do it the way that Isaac suggested before, splash. If you splash and the water comes up, it's no longer connected to the mikveh, and therefore, you can come up. You have all these other.
I meant the water splashing from the mikveh, because
that's the reason.
Mikveh,
that's the reason why they're out. That's the reason why it says you wave the water to go over. Mm-hmm. You don't splash it to separate it from the rest of the mikveh.
Right, that's okay. So it wouldn't be a splash, but at the same time, it doesn't have to be placed on a step that's already covered by water. If you go to a swimming pool and you see that the steps going into the pool, there are some of the steps that are already immersed in water. That's just as perfect as the mikveh itself. We're talking about a step that's just above, it's exposed, but you can stand in the water and cause the water to wave back and forth, and you'll have that step be flooded, be covered by the water as well. You'll just have to be careful then that doesn't wash the needle back into the pool. But go ahead, Robert.
Let me see if I can verbalize what I'm hearing and understanding. All right. You got two countervailing environments. You got a dirty cave and the mikveh, which represents purity.
Yeah.
With a needle on the step, right? So it's the yin and the yang. It's the animal inclination versus the attempt to elevate oneself above it and to be cleansed on an ongoing basis relative to these countervailing processes or environments you're in.
Fabulous. Perfect.
I
So
guess.
it doesn't sound like it does. It sounds okay. This has been wonderful. So
Rabbi, bring him back next time, okay? That'll be good.
if I come back, I'm coming back as a spectator once.
No. You got to be protagonist. You got to be a protagonist.
The needle, you got to be the needle.
Or at least the eye of the needle. Right.
It's very good.
I see you guys want to splash the rabbi.
Yeah, no, wait a minute. Who's going to be the lifeguard? You, Ben?
That's not what I said.
Tell me what Masechta of Gemara you're moving on to now.
Chagiga.
Oh, wow. So I have this thing in my head. I never did it. I have this thing where I keep saying to myself, Brachas is likely the longest tractate in the whole Talmud. I don't
That's
think
what he kept telling us. He kept telling us.
I don't think he gets credit for that because there are other tractates that have more pages to them. But Brachos has the least commentary on a lot of the pages. There is no other tractate that have. I mean, Brachos I think actually has one page that's just from top to bottom, just words of the Gemara. Rashi on some pages doesn't appear, and even some pages where Rashi does appear, Tosfos doesn't appear. So in terms of
words, might be the most.
Sanhedrin has a lot of pages that have very little commentary on.
So you started from Brachos or
from Brachos from the beginning? We completed it, Baruch Hashem.
Okay,
we never jumped there. No, we didn't go Brachos, Erev, and Shabbos.
No.
That's not going to be 2 years before you've done that, huh?
We were thinking of doing Shabbos, but we got a little nervous. So we said,
I think it's always good to throw in a shorter one. You can kind of.
Megillah is always fun.
Megillah? Oh, wow. Okay, so I have to come to these. The Gemara. I have to hear Gemara.
Every day, 10 to 11.
No kidding, really?
Yep, every single day, 6 days a week.
Yeah, wow. Eastern time.
Right. Well, he's in the Eastern time zone. He doesn't have to.
Yeah, we're 10 to 11. All right.
Anyway, thank you so much. This was really a wonderful class. I don't want to conclude for you. You have 3 minutes left, so it's up to you if you want to. Do you have another story or something, or you want to stop here?
I'm gonna conclude by saying that there is an analogy that's commonly used in the teachings of Hasidus. I forget the phrase, but what happens when you go out for dinner or for lunch and the waiter serves you delicious food, it's very uncommon that a person goes up and walks to the kitchen and thanks the chef. They usually extend a thank you to the waiter or the waitress that served them, even though they had nothing to do with the deliciousness of the food. Let's not go into now how this metaphor comes up in the teachings of Hasidus. Any of the things that I'm able to do, if I get to spend an hour learning Torah and teaching it and sharing it with you, and everybody says a thank you, I always make sure to say that the thank you goes to my wife, who takes on more responsibility every time I go ahead and do something. So I'll make sure to pass your gratitude on to her. Okay.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much. It's been a
Thank you, Rabbi.
Very good. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you, rabbis.
Thank you.
Rabbi Smith, thank you. Rebbe, thank you.
Robert, wonderful job.